Thank you and welcome back, everyone, to the T.R.O.N podcast. This is your host, Rashad Woods. Today, I have a very special and accomplished guest whose accomplishments speak for themselves, whose work spans decades and has helped multitudes of people, Dr. Evelyn Higgins. Thank you very much.
Rashad, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on here with you.
First of all, just, your field of work, addiction that you do, it touches every single aspect of life. And, can we get just a basic background about your introduction to medicine? I know it was the state of New York and Harvard, but I'd love to hear, kind of your breakdown of how you got in this field.
Sure. So I started out physical medicine, integrative practice, and I was in a rural area at first, and I was seeing people not having their needs met and becoming dependent on meds, and this is some 30 plus years ago.
Right.
And then 20 years after that, I'm like, well, maybe it's just because I'm in the country and there's no resources. Okay, so then I'm in an urban area and I'm seeing the exact same thing, only by this time, because time had moved forward, I'm seeing people go from dependent to addicted.
Right.
And I'm like, what we're doing is just kind of guesswork. We're throwing darts and hope we land someplace close. And this is people's lives.
Right.
And then personally, I married an alcoholic man who had really several addictions. We had a daughter. A year after she's born, we find out that he's adopted, and we know nothing of his health history whatsoever. I'm seeing these behaviors of addiction and mental health concerns in him. Now I have a child. I'm like, as mom, what do I need to know? Right. So, as a parent, that's what you're here for. You're the umbrella to all of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I kind of segued into there's got to be other ways to do this. And I had been doing more and more education through this whole 35 years of being in practice, always wanting to learn more and do more. And I'm like, we still in the area of addiction and mental health, we're practicing like it's 1950. None of this makes sense. Other areas of healthcare and health have evolved.
Right.
Using technology, using diagnostics. We're saying, sounds like, looks like, try this, try that. We're still not incorporating any of that technology and moving the diagnostics forward into that area of addiction, mental health.
Because it's still true there's a moral flaw, right?
Exactly. And in my TED Talk, Rashad, that's exactly what I say. I mean, this is not a moral flaw.
Right.
This is health. And like any other disease or condition, we have to look at it the exact same way. And we're, again, back to, we're using diagnostics in other areas, but in this area, we're not. It's almost like, you know what, you got yourself here, you can get yourself out. We're not going to put the time into you.
Right.
And there's nothing that can be further from the truth, because you look at just the domino theory of how many people are involved in the life of someone who has an addiction, who has mental health concerns. It's so deep.
I thought it was great when I was listening to what you said. You said the absence of I'm going to paraphrase it. Just because you're not sick doesn't mean you're well. Right?
Health is not the absence of disease.
Right. And I sat there and stunned, and I was like, I never really thought about that way. Just because, because everything's I'm not a doctor, but I would always, if you felt a certain way, then you never thought anything was wrong.
Right. Health is not the absence of disease. And we're not healthy one day and sick the next. That's not how it works. Maybe the occurrence happened that day.
Right.
But all this time is when we're moving towards healthy or sick.
Right.
And that's the part that we fail to recognize, which is slapped right in front of our face.
Right.
Because we want a quick fix for everything.
Why do you think there's such a resistance, because you, with all due respect, you were ahead of the curve with treating this, because now you're seeing documentaries and news broadcasts about, hey, we have to change the way we've been doing things. You identified that 30 years ago, and I'm sure you were screaming to the mountaintops, this is the way to do things. What finally kind of came to a head with the industry and society that kind of started to pivot a little bit?
Great question. I think it was a couple of different things. One, from the science aspect of it, we didn't have all available that we have now.
Right.
Like the way that the technology that we use in our company to look at what we call SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, polymorphism where there's a variant in the gene, an error in the gene. Okay. To look at those things, that only came about tail end of 2014, 15.
Okay. Okay.
So, in fairness, this is still new. And I say
Right.
that in air quotes, right? Because in science, it takes so long to disseminate the information
Okay.
and people to say, I'm willing to do this a new way because people have their routine. This is how I do my job. This, I'm not bringing anything new into it. It's like,
Absolutely.
yeah, but even if we can get better results, you don't want to bring anything new in?
No
So there
question.
was, yeah, there was that part of it. There was the science part of it. And also just there wasn't any like, why does this need to be on the top of our list?
How does now the US has a certain approach to handling addiction, and you very well traveled globally. Is there a difference between countries of how they treat addiction and resources that are available?
Great question, Rashad, because really the answer is no.
Really?
I think that stigma and that moral flaw thing circulates across the planet.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
I was at a conference in Abu Dhabi. It was the
Yeah.
International Society of Substance Professionals, and I was sharing my findings and my information.
Right.
So I'm at a lunch table with people from all over the world. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, so in your country, give me the top four addictions. And
Mhm.
interestingly enough, because like we're a capitalist nation in the United States, right? We
Right.
don't consider cigarettes
Of course not.
or marijuana on that
Not even
list
close.
of
Not
like
even
we
close.
don't wait, that doesn't count.
Right. Right. I mean, you can go to 7-Eleven. Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about.
Exactly. Let's get to the heavier stuff. But interestingly enough, other countries would start out with those two and then go down to the exact same ones. I'm like,
Right.
wow, this is no different anywhere. You know why? Because we're all while we all have our nuances in our DNA, right? 8 billion people in the world with 8
Right.
billion different sets of DNA. No one's
Yes.
exactly the same, which problematic is because we treat everybody as if they're the same and we're not
For,
getting the
for
results,
sure. For sure.
right? But when you look at people, people are the same. We've all had different stories. We've all had different little things that go on in
Right.
our lives, but we all have the same needs. We're all the same people. And
Right.
interestingly enough, with addictions, it was the exact same. It's like, what is going to pacify me to
Right.
feel better in this moment so I don't feel
Correct.
whatever I'm trying not to feel,
Correct. Correct.
right? And it's whatever comes along, whatever age you are, wherever you
Mhm.
are, whatever comes along first, that's like, man, that's what makes me feel better. I got this. I'm
Right.
doing it tomorrow.
Right, right. And so, you have you dipped your toes into so many different things. You worked with the Olympics, you work with athletes, you're a public speaker in both stateside as well as internationally. And you said there's an overriding theme when it comes to what people are seeking for. Now, availability of medicine, I'm just going to deviate a little bit. Is there better opportunity here, or did you notice that there's more experimental drugs in other locations that have helped people get achievable certain results?
Good question. I think overall, we are pretty good with what we have available as a whole. Is
Right,
that available to everyone? Maybe a
right.
different question, right?
Correct, correct.
Um, but some places that are doing things that I kind of like how they're doing are much smaller countries.
Right,
So that's easier to manage 8 million people
of course,
total in your country,
of course.
versus 337 million. So
Right,
there's variables in it. But
right,
interesting that like at these world global conferences, people are sharing their information. We are sharing best practices.
right,
We are sharing, this can be done anywhere because if we use the technology that's grown to allow people to communicate, we can effectively do a better job. It's do we want to do a better job?
right. And I love the fact that you had the kit that was available, for testing for any sort of
Yep.
addiction or genetic predisposition towards things. So when people take that kit, and obviously things are very private, what typically would a patient or a person be looking for? Because obviously they can go to their regular physician for X, Y, and Z, my blood pressure, my
Yeah.
cholesterol
Yeah.
levels. To seek your services out will be something different where they said, I'm specifically either my father, my mother, my grandfather had this issue. I'm trying to stay away from it. And correct me if I'm wrong.
No, right,
or
right.
I see myself falling into this particular path and I want to know if I'm
Yep.
genetically predisposed to this.
Right, right. Great question, Rashad, because prior, really all we had like to see family history was, at Thanksgiving, Uncle Joe, he throws him back and then he's out of his tree, and that became the family chatter, right? But that's all we
Right,
had. That's all
right,
we had to go on, and Aunt
right.
Mary's a little out there.
Mhm.
So, but that was it. Now, where we know that we can look up our genetic makeup, and here's the thing, Rashad, no one has the perfect genome. Some people may think they're perfect, right? But
No,
nobody has the perfect genome. And we all have strengths and we all have weaknesses.
right,
But it's in knowing what those weaknesses are is where we can then say we can optimize this. And
right.
perfect world to me is this is done early in someone's life. It only has to be done
Mhm.
once because it's a DNA test.
Right,
What changes is the expression
right.
of your genes, right?
Correct.
So you get it done once, here's where my weaknesses is. So when it's time for your buddies at whatever age to say, hey, man, Rashad, we're going to go behind school and we're going to do a little bit of this and that. I mean, that's what
Right.
kids do, right?
Of course.
It's like you have a little bit of an antenna in you
No
saying,
question. No
I don't
question.
know that this is the best thing for me.
Right.
Because next day when your butters are like, all right, we did that. You're like, no, I want to do this again. I want to do it
Correct.
again. They're like, we did
Right.
that yesterday. We're doing something different today. No, I want to
Absolutely.
do it. This is why.
Right.
There's
Right.
a predisposition there.
Right. And it's interesting you say that because I think when, we'll refer back a little bit earlier when we talk about, people who are being addicted to things. This is not when you did your experience of rural versus urban, there's misconceptions about this particular group of addicted people because they're
Right.
not strong, they're not weak, they don't have
Right.
access to resources and capital.
Right.
What the reality about it is that it just hits every single segment of society.
Yep.
It's just a question of whether the consequences sometimes of what people are seeing on TV.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. It defies every barrier. It's everywhere.
Right,
And is there an awareness that things
right,
can be done differently? That's the biggest thing. I mean, that's why I do podcasts like yours to
right.
share this information with people because people like after they're like, wow, I had no idea. I'm like, and the shameful part is that we're not sharing that
No question. Without
because it
question.
can make an equal playing ground.
Yeah, and I think when I would research a lot of times when people the history of drugs, and I don't want to overtalk you, but it was a lot of it was when they would have to have soldiers recover from battle and war,
Yep.
right? And so
Yep.
eventually, then it became more widely. It doesn't. Anybody. I hate to say it. When the chemist found out what worked, it got
Yep.
widely spread, right?
You got it. You got it. Yeah. And that's what makes addiction a biopsychosocial disease, right?
Right.
It's not just here's the problem, here's how we're going to treat it. There are so many layers to addiction because we look at what we do, the foundational part. We have to know your unique physiology, starting point across the board. We have to know that. And then it's
Right.
what's happened in your life, right? The big
Right.
T's, the little T's, the big traumas, the little traumas. When did they happen to you? At what
Right.
point were you then, where were you in your life when you were exposed to whatever becomes your choice
Right.
of numbing yourself? But there's always all of those different pieces, but the genetic piece is measurable, right? So we need to know that. And then it's that, okay, what happened to you? It's not a finger pointing, a moral flaw. It's like, tell me the rest of your life.
So when you have this kit that's available, and obviously it's separate from a government program or an employer sponsored insurance program, have you addressed employers to try to get this as part of the benefits package for?
Yep.
I can't imagine you have, right?
Yep. Yep.
How does that go over, and what's been the resistance from the industry?
Resistance from the industry is if it's within the addiction space itself, believe it or not, for as sick as this sounds, part of their business model is people relapsing.
Yeah, right, right, right.
As sick as that sounds.
Yeah. Oh wow.
And that, I
Yeah.
mean, I could just go off on that
Yeah.
for a while. But the other part is some corporations have embraced it. Some are like, yeah, we really don't want to put that much into a program. But when you think about it, what does it cost you to retrain an individual to do this person's job? Just do this.
Right.
You know,
Right.
It's cheaper in the end. If all you care about is dollars and cents, you're going to save money
right.
doing it this way.
I think the most interesting thing is that as a parent myself, you could sit back and say this trait or characteristic could be helpful to your children as well too. Like
Absolutely.
the first thing that went through my mind is like, a kid like that, like what if my kid is predisposition doesn't even know, and then
Right.
they reach a certain age, and then as the parent you're like, wait a minute, how come I never saw that come?
Yep, yep, yep. You bring up a great point because I can't tell the amount of times we see somebody like, say, 21 years old, and the
Mhm.
parent says, I have never seen this behavior in my daughter ever. I'm
Right,
like, "Oh, okay. What happened over the past year?"
right.
Well, they went to college. They're making decisions by themselves for the first time. They're trying to do school. They're trying to handle a part time job. They're
Mhm.
having fun, so they're not sleeping, probably not eating,
Mhm.
and they've got all brand new friends.
Right,
So their entire environment has changed. So it was always here.
right,
But environmentally, these genes weren't turned on, and that's why we never saw the behavior.
right.
That's the beauty of that's called epigenetics. So there's genetics, there's
Okay.
epigenetics. It's only in recent history that we've learned all we know about epigenetics to say this is the game changer because this gives the power back to the individual. We've identified this. Here's what we can do to optimize it. You're still in the driver's seat.
I think what you said about this statement, because when I left for college, and what's crazy is you're 18 years old, you graduate in June, May,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
then literally within 90 days,
Yep.
like you can do the visit, you can go to the campus, you can do all that, your parents can be alumni, etc. But like
Yeah.
that's a huge leap in like 90 days. Like
Yeah.
it's not even like you can't even describe it to somebody,
Yeah.
right? You could
Yep.
have strict parents, you could have had loose parents who let you kind of do your own thing, but there's nothing mentally that really prepares you for like, yo, I actually have like full control of my time.
Exactly. What do I
Right,
do now?
right.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and you start kind of looking over your shoulder a little bit, like who's going to tell me I can't do that?
Yeah. Nobody. So I'm going to double down on it. It's
Oh,
like, yeah.
right.
And we've all been there.
Of course, of course. So, when you talked about people who have, I saw briefly the people who tried to self medicate. What's your recommendations, pluses, minuses of people who kind of said, you know what, I know I have an addiction. I'm gonna. We've all seen cold turkey in the shows. Like, how
Yeah.
does that work?
Depending on what the addiction is. Like if you're an alcoholic and you go cold turkey, you could
Ooh,
die. That's
yeah,
actually the most
I,
dangerous.
yes, I saw that. You have to go off
Yeah.
it, in stages.
Exactly. And people think, well, it's just alcohol. Like I can buy it in the store. It can't be that bad.
Right.
That's the most dangerous, actually. So, depending on where the person is in their addiction, really is what we would need to know of where should we start with this individual. Like, if you go to our website, Wired for Addiction or Wired
I was
BioHealth,
there. I was
you
there.
you can get a complimentary consultation
Right.
with one of our clinicians or wellness counselors and share your story of where you're at because we may say first I want you to go detox at a facility for 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, wherever, it depends on where they're at. But while
Right.
we're doing that, we're going to send you the lab kit. You're going to do your buccal swab, your cheek swab, so we have that information. When you get out, we're ready to jump in. Another kind of addiction, let's say that their alcoholism isn't that bad, that they binge drink maybe,
Correct.
weekends, something like that. Okay, we can handle that a different way. Let's just jump right into the swabs. Let's get going.
Yeah.
All, and then there's what we call the process addictions: sex, porn,
Mhm.
gambling,
Right.
shopping, food, right?
Right.
Those are all addictions as well.
Right.
It's whatever you're taking from the outside to bring inside to change how you're feeling in here, what makes you, what you think, feel better. And you're doing that self medicating, not even knowing that's what you're doing. You are trying to change physiologically
Mhm.
what's happening with you.
That's nuts. And a lot of people, I think also what hasn't helped is technology that's at people's disposal right now to a degree, right? I mean, I remember getting a computer and like it was like in the living room, right? And you had to have access to it. It was a process to get technology in your household.
Yep. Yep.
Well,
Yep.
now everybody has a smartphone and has, all these different devices, and people can get their vices in real time.
You got access 24/7.
Right, right.
Yep.
So,
It's in your face.
yeah. And so, what lifestyles have you seen that are more conducive to addiction? Just overall, like if you had to kind of say, okay, if this was like the bubble, do you have 5 to 10 things that maybe you could be a possible potential, addicted to something not healthy?
It really runs the gamut of everything, Rashad.
Okay.
That's why knowing what your unique physiology is so important.
Hmm.
Because I could say, like, with kids, like that high school transition kind of thing, the uber rich societies where mom and dad are never present,
Right.
they're looking for something else. But I can also say in an impoverished community where mom and dad aren't present, we can see the same thing.
Right.
So it's just, I can't really say across the board because it's
Okay.
everywhere. It's everywhere. And then
Right.
there's your quiet, like I was on a podcast yesterday, and the host brought up porn and sex addiction.
Hmm.
And I said, I've talked to people that we've had as patients and clients that have been having affairs their entire marriage, 40 years.
Hmm.
That one, you don't see the way someone who's coming in hungover, you can tell hasn't showered in days,
Right.
right? You're like, man, what are you doing? I can
Right.
see you're going downhill. What are you
Absolutely.
doing? We need to talk. But
Right.
that one, you don't see anything.
Right.
And, oftentimes I'll say, as sad as it sounds, it's when they get busted that it's like, now I need to do something because I'm going to lose my family, my home, my money, my
Right.
everything. And no one sets out to wake up one day and say, today's the day. I'm
Right.
going all in. I'm going to lose my wife, my
Right.
husband, my
Right.
kids, my job, my home, my
Absolutely.
money. I'm going to lose everything.
Right.
No one. It's this creeping, creeping, creeping boom, and then you're there.
I think, you mentioned that, and I'll just talk briefly about a film I watched. It came out like 10 years ago with Michael Fassbender. Shame, I believe that was what it was called. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but he had an
I haven't
addiction.
seen it.
It's a really, really, really great movie, but it's similar about the topic you just talked about because, you know, you're sitting there watching this movie and you're like, yo, they're actually addressing exactly what you just talked about. Like the guy was like,
Yeah.
he was like a software engineer or a marketing guy or something like that. And then you found out he had this darker side, but he didn't come in
Yep.
hungover and nobody
Yep.
saw. And that's immediately what I thought about when I heard that. Like, oh,
Yep.
this is deep. I
Yep.
did want to ask you briefly, and I know you've told your story, so I'm not putting anything out there that you haven't said. Something you said about your second stroke, mini stroke you
Mhm.
had at
Yep.
46, that kind of
Yep.
resonated with me. Can you
Yeah.
talk about that a little bit briefly?
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, I was living a ridiculous life, and I look back now and like the levels of stress were just ridiculous. And could I, um, say, well, I have to do this, I have to do that, and justify every step of the way? Yeah, I could. I'm a single parent. I'm a blah, blah, blah. My husband's addiction had him die at 42.
That's terrible.
It's like, and I
That's
these all these things that I have to do justified. Okay, but my daughter's the most important person in the world to me, and I'm going to leave her with no parents because this is what's happening with me. And it
right,
was like when I talk about you're not healthy one day and sick the next. I
right.
was I was headed to that mini
Yeah,
stroke, that TIA every day,
right.
and it was the day it happened, and it was actually the second one that took me to the emergency room because the first one I didn't have time for. Like what? You hear yourself say, "What are you, an idiot?" Right? But I can laugh
I didn't
now.
want to laugh, right? But just
Yeah, I can laugh now. But that's the insanity of it. We all tell ourselves our own stories that we
right,
want to hear, right?
of course.
Yeah. So my office manager says to me, "Doc, you're having a stroke." My reply, "I know."
Oh wow.
So she's like, her
Right,
husband's an EMT. She's like, he's coming in. He comes in, and she's like, I'm going to call the ambulance. I said, just drive me, because then I could still speak. I knew what was
right.
happening. I was pretty much slumped
Absolutely.
over my desk. By the time we got to the hospital, which was like 20 minutes ish, I
Mhm.
couldn't speak and I couldn't walk. She had to do the intake for me, answer the questions. I'm in a wheelchair. It went that fast.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So first time I had taken, but I'm still in the emergency room. I'll back up.
For sure.
Doctor, several hours of diagnostics, all that kind of stuff. I'm on IVs, yada yada, the whole workup. And the doctor says, well, you've had a transient ischemic attack, a mini stroke. I'm like, I said, this is actually my second one. He's like, what? I said, I
Right.
had one 10 days ago. He goes, you got to be kidding me. I'm like,
Yeah.
no, no, I didn't have time. And I got away with that one. Like this
Right.
one was, into much longer and
For
more
sure.
serious. And he
For
said,
sure.
well, your chances of having a full blown stroke that takes you out of the game within the next 90 days are much greater. You
Mm.
need to, and he says two things. You need to reduce your stress and take a baby aspirin a day. So this is hours later. I have half a funny bone left by that time. I'm like, Doc, slow down. I need to write down, reduce stress. I'm like,
Right.
how do you do that? Right?
Especially if you're hearing that.
Yeah. How do you
Especially-
do that?
Right.
But it was time to get real, and I started doing a lot of research. Now I'm 64 now, so that's how long ago that was.
Right. Right. Right.
I start doing research. I'm like, I need more than obviously reduce stress. But what was changing physiologically
Correct.
in my body that got me to the point of the incident on that day that changed my ability to speak, walk, think, all of it?
Right.
So I started learning about neurotransmitters, which now today are much more common in conversation, things like
For sure.
serotonin and dopamine. But then people would be like, what are you talking about?
Of course they
Nobody was talking about those things then. So I started doing a lot of research. I'm like, I need to know how I got here. I know stress got me here, but what was happening physiologically? So that was kind of the beginning of the change for me into the neuroscience, epigenetics. And then and prior to that, I had already became a diplomate in addictions, compulsive disorders, all that because of what was going on with my husband, my daughter, what I needed to know from an
Absolutely.
educational standpoint. And then, like I said, it was only 2015 that the ability to look at the genetic SNPs comes about, and then in fairness to science, then we had COVID and
Mhm.
all our time was spent on that. So there
Right.
was this lapse of what else can we learn and what's new.
Right. Right. Now, I know, and I know I really appreciate your time. I just had one more question, and
Sure.
I think this would probably inform people, and even myself included. When there's high level of addiction, obviously it's an addiction problem across the country, but when you see it in certain economic areas, you're like, but drugs are expensive or they cost. So how exactly can, and this is just my ignorance, how does it get to certain areas? They may not have the income that you, on surface, you think that how could drugs actually be getting to that area?
Right.
I'm just curious, how does that, because it's such a terrible disease.
How does it happen? Yeah. Because the guys that mastermind let's say it's like there's a map up of where we're going next. They're
Right.
masterminding where they're going to go. These are brilliant. I mean, these are CEOs of their own company, right? The dealers.
I've watched
They're
the
brilliant.
documentaries. Yeah, I've watched
Yeah.
the documentaries.
Yeah. You take that and you put it into something that's legitimate, man, you'll do great. But
It's crazy.
they're planning strategy where we're going to go,
Yeah.
and they're like, these people will be hungry for what we have to offer, and they'll figure out the money part. They'll figure out how to get it, and whether it means doing without or doing something that you really don't want to do,
Right.
they're going to figure it out because that addiction
Right.
drives you. Once you're there, it drives you. You are no longer in control of your own life.
It's mind blowing, and I can't emphasize enough that when I was watching some of your videos, this is one of the most personal things because every single person has a story that this has hit them at. Like you're
Yep.
not immune to it, right? Your zip code
Right.
and your area code. We've
Yep.
all had. If you've seen it, you've experienced it, and it's not. It's evolved from the laugh at the dinner table, like we talked about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And like my husband, if you looked at, he was a Marine and a cop and, all the things that it's like Mr. Squared Away,
Right.
but you close the door and this is what's
Right.
going on at home.
Right. So I've obviously taken up a lot of your time just out of your busy schedule. Like, your list of things that you've accomplished. I just find time to do all this, right? You're helping Olympic teams. You're on all these different boards. You're an international speaker. You're a TED Talk a speaker, excuse me. How can people, when they watch your show, find more about you? They don't need, you can Google me and I'm a speck of dust. Like you and what but how can we find more about Dr. Evelyn Higgins and what she
But
does?
Rashad, it's you doing what you do that helps. So give
Yes,
yourself a little.
I appreciate it.
I appreciate what you're doing, and the public appreciates what you're doing because you're having
Great.
the conversations that otherwise won't be had.
Thank you.
So going to our websites, whether it be wiredforaddiction.com, all spelled out, Wired for Addiction, or wiredbiohealth.com. And we started Wired BioHealth because people were coming to us saying, I'm not quite at the addiction place,
Right.
but I'm not right.
Absolutely.
Is
Absolutely.
there other things that we can do? I'm like, absolutely, because that's the perfect place. Like, let's get you before you're not there, right? And let's change
Sure.
it. The course is easier to change. So go to the websites, wiredforaddiction.com, wiredbiohealth.com. Reach out on there, schedule that consultation. and just as open as you and I are having this conversation, Rashad, just share what's going on, because if we don't know, we can't help, but if we do, we can help.
I think, and I say this very respectfully. I appreciate you, and more importantly, I think your Facebook posting as a person is a lot. It's better to reach out to you and the experts in your field than to try to make yourself. Oh, I'm
Yeah.
gonna make this Facebook post and fight my addiction. Like a lot of people try
Yeah.
to do that, and you're like, yeah, I don't think that's.
Yeah, no, there's way too much of that stuff going on.
Yeah, yeah. That's. I'm sure you've
Not
talked
good.
about that at length. I can only
Yeah.
imagine. So, but I want to thank you so much for your time. It's been an honor and pleasure. Unless you have something else that you wanted to discuss, I want to
No, that
really thank you.
absolutely great, Rashad. And like I said, I thank you for what you're doing, having these conversations, not afraid to have them. So that's great. Thank you for what you're doing.
I salute you for all your great work, and I look forward to any follow up conversations we can have. Thank you so much, Dr.
Sounds
Evelyn
great,
Higgins.
Rashad. Thank you. Bye
Thank you.
bye.